Doesn't it? I mean, if you look at how far we've got between the Europeans and everyone else at Doha, Peter Hartshare, and you also look at what came out of the G20, do you have any hope that there is going to be any of that reform? Because it seemed to me, reading the communiques, that they might have tiptoed around the tulips, but there wasn't much real structural focus in those communiques.
That's right. There's a lot to be worked out. I guess the most hopeful development we've seen since the last G20 summit was in the last 48 hours, the announcement from China that the Chinese government is prepared to put $50 billion of fresh capital into the IMF, which tells us that, in a serious way, China is prepared to participate in the restructuring and remodelling of the IMF. I think that's the most hopeful sign we've seen, but there's still a long way to go. Can I just remark on Bob's point about the European Union? I mean, power and economic size has transformed since World War II when these institutions were set up. Isn't it terrible that it took a global crisis, as is commonly asserted, without precedent since the Great Depression, to bring about any change? We had experts, we had some countries banging on for a decade, nearly 2 decades, about the need to reform the IMF, and absolutely nothing happened. It's taken an event of this magnitude to even begin real progress. But the Europeans are terrific, because they define themselves opportunistically according to the occasion, so that when they talk about Europe always asserts itself to be the world's biggest economic power. So on that occasion, they seamlessly blend all the countries into one thing called Europe. But then when it comes to voting on the IMF, they're all separate nation states, and they retain and jealously guard their rights to vote, their quotas, and their representation at the table. But at least we've started the process. We've got in principle recognition that it has to change, and we've got the argument begun on how to make the change. And we've got, as I say, the most hopeful sign yet that the Chinese obviously think that real change is possible. That
brings us to the interesting point of what the best forum is for making that change, because a lot of the impetus has come out of the G20, which is 85% of the world's GDP, but is the G20 the right place for reform of these institutions that have been around for more than 60 years? What about the UN? Is that the universal forum with the most legitimacy? Tim Harcourt, is G20, is it G20 now instead of G7, and would the UN be better?
Well, I think, firstly on the European point, a lot of it's what Bob said is to do with expectation. I mean, the people in Brussels started out with Eurovision, they've ended up with Europhobia, with all the additional states coming in. And in some ways, I think, if they had said, we're going to have a customs union and we're going to break down economic barriers between nation states, you'd say the European project's a great thing. But when you want to have a foreign policy and you want to have a constitution, that's perhaps where you get overreach, and that's where institutions fail. With respect to the G20, we have to look at the same thing in a sense that what expectations do we have of the G20? You'd have to say probably that Australia under Kevin Rudd, probably under Peter Costello and John Howard before, did actually G up the G20 to a greater extent because they knew that Australia's a small power. It's in our interests, as it was in the interests to form the Cairns Group in the WTO, to have a body like the G20 where Australia can be a leading voice and have influence rather than a situation in the world where it's G3 or G7. So I think it's obviously in our national interest, but it also perhaps gives a new president like President Obama a chance to be a consensus builder too, instead of, as was said in the previous session, US having to be 911 for everyone. It actually gets a chance to build across the different economic blocs.
A lot depends on what we ask these Gs to do. If there's a way in which the G20 is a pretty good forum. It's not perfect, but it does have a kind of a weight of, on the one side, balance of representation. The large countries are all there. A few not so large countries have squeaked in. And then on the other side, it's dispersed. We've got the world or the continents represented. In a sense, their job, though, is to hold these meetings and to give direction. Implementation, though, will have to be done at the functional institutions. So the financial would be done at the IMF primarily, or also through the Financial Stability Forum and BIS. When it came to trade, it would be done at the WTO. There are other things which the UN does, particularly in the climate area. So I would see a complex system. It's not necessarily to have just one organization.
But the driving force would be G20?
But in a sense, some leadership would come from the G20. The reality is meaningful changes that involve significant redistributions are not going to come out of a forum like the United Nations. One country, one vote is not a reflection of the underlying power and economic realities in the system. The G20 is a closer representation of those. So it's necessary to have those, the concurrence of those players, although in addition, there's much that could be done through the UN as well.
Peter Hutcher, do you agree?
Yeah, look, in any of these things, it's a compromise. The larger the number of the people in a room, the less likely you are to get a real decision. And yet the smaller the number, the less the legitimacy. So where's the balance? Until recently, it was, on the one hand, you've got the UN, which has got 180 members and rarely can agree on anything. On the other hand, you've got the G8, which was a much smaller group. They agreed on most things. They rarely acted on any. The G20 is a compromise, and I think it's the best available. It's not a bad balance, as Bob has already said. It brings in the ambitious new rising powers plus the old ones. It's the best available mechanism, and that balance, that compromise seems to be about right. So, yeah.
We talked earlier about, Robert was talking earlier about separating the supervisory role from the handing out the money. But if we can move away from the sort of the broader economic surveillance and more at this question of whether or not you can get better global financial regulation. And that becomes a very sticky problem, again, with this issue of national regulatory systems, different cultures, different legal systems. And Robert, you just talked there about the Financial Stability Forum, which I think has been rebranded the Financial Stability Board. But is that the right framework? Is that the right place? Or when I said to you before about the WFO, does it need something more? Can we ever go past just getting an agreed sense of norms? I mean, how nebulous is this concept of global regulation?
Well, again, we come back to the nation state. And are the nations going to be prepared to give up the authority to regulate their domestic financial institutions? I doubt it. We're certainly not ready for that. And in fact, I think Basel, which is an effort to impose standards on the banking system, was a failure, basically. The Basel II told banks that they could come up with their own risk models. We've learnt about risk models now, a lot more than many knew beforehand. Didn't work too well. I think, actually, the fortunate thing about the current financial crisis is that we actually don't need a lot of global governance to take care of what's wrong with the financial institutions. We actually need the United States in particular, the United Kingdom and other countries to get their acts together. And they have every incentive to do that. So people understand what needs to be done, and it's going to be implemented at an individual country level. I think where international organizations are really required is for those innocent bystanders who have to experience the fallout from this crisis. That's where the IMF, for instance, has a big role to play. Poor countries, developing countries who don't have the financial resources to stabilize their own economies and who find themselves in difficulty through no fault of their own, they're the ones who really need that international organization. So when it comes to regulation, I think comity is very good, exchanging information, understanding what's happening in each other's countries. After all, many were blindsided completely by what was going on in the United States, although the U.S. authorities were among that group too, unfortunately. That sort of thing, I think, can really be improved. But I don't think we're at the stage where we're going to allow some international body the kind of power that our national regulators have.
At the same time, at the G20, there was a lot of talk about trying to get global systems of regulation. It was all a little vague, but it was very much feel good. You know, we're all going to unite and we're going to, you know, make sure that this doesn't happen again. Tim Harcourt, was it more about feeling good, and is it far more about everyone knowing what needs to be done and going home and doing it in their own country?
Yeah, look, it's not just the institutions alone. I think a lot of pessimistic people, you know, said in the 70s that we could never ever have a situation where countries would voluntarily run systematic, consistent global fiscal monetary policies. And we've seen during the global financial crisis fiscal stimulus packages across the world, and people being very conscious of relative stances of monetary policy. We've actually been able
Well, we actually had united
to
cuts,
do that.
didn't we, at one point?
That's right. And I mean, what's interesting about Peter Harcher's reference to the Great Depression is how we've learnt from past policy mistakes. I mean, I'm an economic historian, and if you look at the Great Depression in Australia, what were the three policy measures that economists advised and governments implemented? They said cut government spending, cut the basic wage, and the arbitration court cut the basic wage by 10% and prolonged unemployment. And lastly, they said put up tariffs. And if you think now, what's the current stance of the Australian government? Well, fiscal stimulus, not contraction. Make sure wages grow in line with productivity and have an accommodating monetary policy, and commit to free trade, not put up tariffs. And I think I actually agree with Michael Fullerlove. Made a point earlier today that Obama, in his heart of hearts, is a free trader. And if you look at the history, basically the Democrats were once the free traders, and the Republicans the party of protection. Most of Obama's advisors are open economy people, and in many ways, when you think about Obama's own background, he's more likely to be internationalist, and he could actually build a progressive coalition for free trade. We know that when we look at the studies that Bob's done in the US and studies we've done here in Australia, that as you've opened up the economy, wages and conditions in the exporting sectors have improved, and they've actually provided gains throughout the economy. So I actually think there's a progressive case there in terms of policy.
Ali, can I pick up on Tim's point about the lessons you learn from a crisis? One of the things that is worrying me about what lessons we seem to be learning from this crisis is that, and you know, Bob, I'd love to hear from you how it looks in the US at the moment, but it seems to me that this is resolving quite quickly to a single point. I think where we have a crisis with several key contributing elements is being simplified to a single point, and that is regulation good, deregulation bad. Now, if you'd attended only to that agenda item, we would still have an international recession. It wouldn't be as bad, it would be a lot milder, but we'd still have one. Now, it seems to me that a lot of key points are being lost. Regulation versus deregulation gets all the attention because it's an ideological question and it resolves itself quickly into political partisan argument. So that gets the heat, therefore it gets the attention and dominates the agenda. I'm troubled that we seem to be drawing no conclusions about other key contributing factors. Here's one, which I would suggest is a critical element in this whole debacle, and that is monetary policy. For this crisis to be transmitted through derivatives and bank lending practices, and then to spread around the world, there had to be an event which was being spread. It wasn't that derivatives just one day all turned nasty. And the loans all turned nasty. There had to be an event. That event was the bust in the US housing market. The bust in the US housing market, I've long argued, was a product of the bubble in the US housing market, which in turn was a product of a very unfortunate and avoidable US monetary policy, courtesy of Alan Greenspan.
But hasn't that been recognised? I mean, I read an enormous amount about, basically when you've got zero interest rates, of course, money's cheap.
Well, I guess this is why I'm keen to hear Bob's point. Is there any sign of...
I think the art of central banking was reduced to the idea that central banks should just worry about inflation. And what was going on in asset markets was not their concern. So as long as you're controlling inflation, you're doing fine. And in fact, if we could just set you on automatic pilot, many people believed it would even be better than having a central bank. But the fact is, I think the deep lesson that we've learned, or one of them, that people are appreciating, is that the central bank can't ignore asset markets. If you've got a low inflation rate, which is what we had, and a bubble has emerged in your housing market, you could run into deep trouble.
But that is well recognised now.
But that is well recognised. Yeah, I differ on that question. I think it is a major lesson. The answers really are sort of the new lessons we're going to give our central bankers, have yet to be drawn, because it recognises that the world is much more complicated, and that you have to be worried about what goes on in these asset markets. You don't just control inflation.
Is this discussion being had in the Fed, in official circles in the US, or is it just among observers?
Well, I would say, the Fed in the US actually has always had a somewhat broader mandate than some other central banks. The Fed, yes, is supposed to be concerned about inflation, but the Fed is also supposed to be concerned about unemployment. And if you're worried about unemployment, clearly asset instability can be a major source. Now, whether it's yet translated into behavior, we have yet to see. But I do think there is an appreciation of the need for rethinking. But that's about as far as it's gone, because recognize the complexities that we have to now recognize really present us with significant problems and make the life of a central bank. I guess, people are walking around, they say, we want our bankers to be much duller. We want banking to be a very dull industry. Well, I would say that may be true, but central banking has got to become much less dull, because we've realized how key a role they have to play.
But of course, the big risk there is that they become kingmakers, because if they have to make judgments about things before they happen, then in essence, they have to pick bubbles before they bubble.
Exactly. And this comes back to the deep political question of why we got into this crisis. It wasn't only intellectual problem. As you pointed out earlier, people recognized that this was a crisis waiting to happen. So why didn't people do anything about it? The simple explanation is it's very hard to pull the punch bowl away when people are having a party. And if you asked, we recognized very well in the United States when I was in the US government that the GSEs, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, these housing institutions were an utter disaster waiting to happen. What you had was profit-making institutions that had a government guarantee standing behind them, or an implicit government guarantee. This was a disaster. So what did you need to do to stop this? Well, you had to make it very clear that there was going to be no government guarantee. If you did that, what would happen? The cost of mortgages would have gone up. The estimates were by about 25 basis points, 0.25%. Now, how can the government be held responsible for increasing the cost of home ownership? Is that a political cost they were willing to pay? Absolutely no. So that was the political constraint of pulling the punch bowl away. And that's why, it seems to me, no matter how good we are in architecture, no matter how good our designs are, we have to acknowledge that we're very vulnerable, because when the government tries to step in and to stop things, there are going to be a lot of credible arguments on the other side. People are going to say, but we've been providing large amounts of houses for poor people. And why don't you want that to continue? What's the problem? So it's easy to be wise after the event, but politically it's hard to do it beforehand.
I'm going to open this up to questions in just a minute, but Tim, I did just want to ask you, actually, if you could give us an Australian perspective on that, because I wonder, with our central bank, we also have very, it has a narrow form that it has to follow in terms of our inflation band, But do you think that our central bank needs to get more with it and redraw what it does, or have we handled it well?
Well, I used to work for the Reserve Bank, and when you walk into the foyer at Martin Place, it's got basically stability of the currency and full employment. I mean, the objectives are both. And I think to some extent you can probably give the Reserve Bank a lot of credit, in the Asian financial crisis for the actions that they took, and also the advice they gave to Asian central banks, and also currently. I mean, Glenn Stevens was pretty quick on the trigger.
Is the mandate too narrow, though?
Well, I think it has to be full employment, and you have to have inflation there. But I think the difference has been that we went through several, I guess, of our own financial shocks with the state banks and so on in the 80s and 90s, that we've now separated part of the prudential regulation with APRA from the actual central bank role. And, I mean, I actually think Bob's right in terms of the types of power that central banks have has actually been quite important since they've had independence and since they've had inflation targeting. I had a choice of going to the ACTU or the Reserve Bank, and I thought, well, the ACTU's got the Accord and it's got Bill Kelty, that's where the power is. But when you look back on it, well, the Reserve Bank's where, you know, all the power is, and you don't have to run for pre-selection. And lastly, I think Peter's made a very good point, because in political economy we tend to polarise. If we think deregulation's gone out of control, we go back to regulation. And you've seen this now, as Bob said, in the States, is that with the subprime crisis, people on the right will say, well, it's all those dopey bleeding heart Democrats giving money to poor people. That's what's caused it. Whilst on the left, they're saying, well, that occurred, but what about the AAA ratings for the subprime mortgages that were passed on? That's the issue. And I think ultimately we can set up architecture, we can sit up here and be very, very rational and sensible, but at some stage it does get involved in political economy. Will people take those positions?
Can I add just briefly, the Reserve Bank of Australia has been, this asset question has been on its mind for some years, and Glenn Stevens, in fact, drew attention to this exact point in a speech just a few weeks ago.
Indeed, in terms of new home buyers as well?
No, in terms of well, he did that, but I mean in terms of the question of the mandate and whether central banks should look at asset price bubbles. You know, it's funny. People who say the status quo is fine, the central bank should look at inflation only and not at asset prices. They say, oh, a central bank can't pick an asset bubble. If the stock market's turning into, getting frothy and getting beyond fundamental valuation, a central bank can't pick that. The market's better at doing that. But they should just stick with tradable goods inflation. It's funny that they have such confidence that central bankers can pick incipient inflation problems in tradable goods, but not incipient inflation problems in asset prices. I think it's a dishonest, it's flawed, and in some cases it's politically and ideologically driven. When Ian Macfarlane was the Reserve Bank governor in Australia, the asset price question was very much on his mind. He didn't say a lot about it, but they took it into account. He jawboned a lot about the bubble in property prices, you might remember. Talked about it at every opportunity, tried to warn people, talk it down, and then, as I just said, Glenn's raised it publicly in a speech. One of the current assistant governors, Philip Lowe, wrote an important paper for the Bank of International Settlements a decade ago, pointing out the importance of taking asset prices into account in setting interest rates. So this is something where the Reserve Bank has been alert, aware and active for years.
But it's easy to say that, but it is a very difficult task. You'll recall Alan Greenspan, who we're now knocking, told us in the mid-90s that the stock market was guilty of irrational exuberance when the Dow Jones was around, I guess, 6,800 or something like 6,000, right? And it went to 14,000, and it gave us Alan Greenspan financed 5 incredibly prosperous years for the United States economy, sort of the The ones when I was on the Council of Economic Advisors.
Thanks, Bob.
Great. I don't claim ownership, but I do. It was great to be there. So what you can see then is that would have been a case where ex post we look back, we say, what a mess it would have been to slow down the American economy, in the mid-90s, because some central banker thought that the markets were behaving irrationally. In fact, underpinning that, and Greenspan later recognized this, I don't know whether he agreed with the asset prices, but he realized that there was a huge increase, a surge in productivity, which warranted more financing of expansion in the economy. So that's why I say it's going to be an art form. There aren't going to be simple rules, and central bankers are going to have the guts to make and we're going to have to live with them making calls which may turn out to have been the wrong kind of calls. So it's
hindsight's a wonderful thing, isn't it?
Exactly.
Let's open this up to some questions from the floor. We've got a couple of microphones around.
Thank you. Shortly after Kevin Rudd came to power, he announced his intention to create an Asian Union in the model of the European Union. I haven't heard much since then. It seems to be clouded in a bit of secrecy. I'm wondering, can you enlighten us as to what the development of that idea was? And in your opinion, is it in Australia's interest, given that we're a smallly populated democratic Western country, to join an economic and potentially political union with Asian states who are highly populated and authoritarian?
Do you want to direct that question? Or
anyone who can answer it, please do.
Bob? No, just kidding.
What do you think, Bob?
Well, why don't you start, Peter? You start with your impressions.
In pitching that idea, Kevin Rudd made had an unfortunate line in the speech where he did make a comparison with Europe, and he's spent all the time since backpedaling from that. His idea is not in any way like the European Union. His idea is simply to replicate, in talking about defence and security and foreign policy issues, what already happens with APEC. So it's to take the 20 or so major states of the region, get them together for a talk fest once a year, and with some potential to develop that further. That's all. As to your question about its progress, I don't think there's been much secrecy, and in fact I think the main guy responsible for stitching it together, Dick Woolcott, is giving a speech about it in the next few days. But generally, my understanding is that the general reception he's had has been, in principle, that's fine. A number of states have objected. In fact, 2 weeks ago, the Defence Minister of Indonesia, Sudarsono, said we don't need this thing, we're happy with ASEAN. ASEAN, of course, has been a complete and dismal failure, but if you're the biggest state, if you're Indonesia, there are reasons why you'd be completely happy to have a pliable outfit like ASEAN to belong to. So he's made some progress, but he hasn't got consensus, and I think it's probably some years away is the best answer I can give.
And I guess, if you take the original intentions of the European Union, that is more trade and investment integration. We've now got the ASEAN FTA with Australia and New Zealand. When you look at trade flows, very much part of the Asia Pacific, and now even foreign direct investment, which traditionally had been I was going to say the old world, I won't say that, but it was traditionally North America, Europe, Japan, now part of the region as well. To some extent we have made that progress evolutionary, and he's looking at a way to further deal with the institutions across the region.
We have come to the end of it. And just to wrap it up, I want to ask each of our panellists in about 10 or 15 seconds to answer the question of whether or not this global crisis, given that, as Peter Hartcher said, we could be seen to be over the worst of it now. You look at what's happening on stock markets, confidence is improving. Yes, we are in a global recession, unemployment will get worse. But if people are starting to feel better, will momentum be lost? Will this crisis go to waste? Tim, if I can start with you.
Well, we're starting to see some probably more bamboo shoots than green shoots coming through in terms of the global economy, and that's been good for Australia, but you still have to have institutional reform, and probably when things are good is a good time to do it. Economic nationalism, I think the best counterfactual we've got is Australia and Argentina, and they're economic nationalists, we're open, and it's a matter of don't buy from me, Argentina. So I think that answers your question.
Peter Hartcher.
I'll answer in one sentence. On balance, yes. On balance, I think, yes, the opportunity will be lost and the momentum lost.
You are a glass half empty, aren't you?
Sorry, you asked my opinion.
Fair enough.
There you go.
Robert Lawrence?
I still think this is going to have lasting effects, that this crisis is changing the way people look at the world, and even if we get a recovery, we're going to look back on this as a real historical watershed.
You could join me in thanking the panellists, Tim Harcourt, Peter Harcher and Professor Robert Lawrence.